I'd like to introduce today's presenter, Rob Bagby, Msdn Developer Evangelist for the Microsoft Corporation. Rob, you now have the floor.
Thanks so much, Sarah. I really appreciate it. And good morning to everybody on this webcast, if it is in fact morning in your time zone. If not, good afternoon or good evening. We are going to be, this is our, I believe, fifth part of our ASP.NET Ajax Client Library series, and we are going to be delving into behaviors, and then beyond behaviors, we're going to be talking about how to use the extenders, or how to create an extender that will expose our behavior via ASP.NET server controls. So, without any further ado, let's jump right in. We're going to start this off with a demonstration. I'm just going to show you what the goal is, what we're going to be working towards today, and what we're going to be explaining. So I'm going to go into, if you've seen any of the previous 4 sessions in our series, you'll be familiar with this application, where I've simulated a typical shopping cart type application where you can choose items, add them into the cart, you can delete items from the cart. Well, I've added some functionality to it to make it a bit visually more appealing. As I mouse over the images for my paging functionality, you'll note that if it's enabled, I get a nice indication that the mouse over has occurred. And so we're going to talk about how we've implemented this using behaviors in the client-side libraries, and then we'll go ahead and extend this a little bit, no pun intended, by creating an extender control and expose this via a server control in ASP.NET. So that's the goal for today, and let's jump into it and get back to our slides. Now, I know there's some folks that have not been privy to all of the sessions, so we're going to do a little review, and for those of you who have seen the previous sessions, we're going to be reviewing our object-oriented session for a few minutes here to talk about the OO nature of both JavaScript as well as the ASP.NET Ajax client libraries. And so even if you have seen the previous sessions, a good review is always helpful. The reason why I do this is because we can't really talk about behaviors until we understand fully, first of all, how JavaScript works and how the prototype architecture within JavaScript works, and then beyond that, how our classes and inheritance in the ASP.NET Ajax libraries work. So those classes build upon the JavaScript prototype model. So we're going to start at the beginning and kind of walk through this. We'll do a couple quick samples, and then we'll jump on into behaviors. So here's an example of JavaScript prototype. You'll notice at the top we've got a function person where we pass in a couple arguments, first name and last name. And inside of this function we're setting a couple of instance level fields. This function that you see here is known as a constructor function. And it acts much like a constructor that you're probably familiar with in, say, C# or VB.NET. What you'll see below that is an indication that our constructor function, in fact every function, has a prototype. And so down here you'll see person.prototype. I'm essentially accessing the prototype of my person function or my person constructor function and adding a method to it. And so my person prototype has now got a toString method associated with it. It also, in the implementation in there, we're just simply returning out an appended string. And then at the bottom you'll see an indication where I've essentially newed up a person constructor, and I've inherited the toString method from my prototype. And we'll go into this a little bit more when we see some code in the demonstration, but it's just suffice it to say it's important for you to realize what a constructor function is, and that every function has a prototype, and you can reference that by the prototype property. And then beyond that, every prototype can refer back to its constructor by a constructor property. So I could refer back to this person constructor by typing person.prototype.constructor. And we'll see that a little bit more when we get into the code. So as I stated, everything kind of builds upon one another, and as we start looking at classes in ASP.NET Ajax, that's clearly the case. We extend it We extend the functionality, but we're quite simply using the same prototype model that we just saw. So let's see how we extend that. Where you see the big red number 1 here, you'll see that's where we're essentially creating a namespace. We've added the concept of namespaces in ASP.NET Ajax, and to create a namespace, you simply type .register namespace and then pass in the string representation of your namespace. Now, in number 2, you're going to see that we're just creating a typical constructor function. There are really 2 differences to what we're doing here and what we do in the typical JavaScript outside of ASP.NET Ajax client libraries. One is we pass in the fully qualified path to our class. In this case, the namespace plus our class name. So contoso.components that was registered earlier in type.register namespace. And the other thing you'll see here is we call initialize base. And when you start dealing with inheritance in ASP.NET Ajax, this initialize base is a key component. So if you are implementing another class, make sure you call initialize base, or you won't get the inheritance behavior you expect. Then inside of here, you'll see we do the same thing we did earlier. We create our instance level fields, and we can initialize those fields if we want from the arguments passed in our constructor. And number 3, you'll see we've just got our typical prototype, which looks exactly like it did in just plain old JavaScript. And at the bottom, this is the last extension that we add, and it's the ability to register a class or create this class type inside of JavaScript. And all you do is call register class from your specific type name and pass in the fully qualified path to your class or fully qualified name of your class. And then you can optionally pass in a type that you want to implement. And then as well, you can also pass in an array of interfaces that you want to implement. So inside of, just by adding a few extensions like creating a namespace, calling initialize base, and then calling register class, we're going to get some pretty great functionality, including inheritance as well as interface inheritance. So we've really extended this model quite a bit. So utilizing inheritance in ASP.NET Ajax, which I just simply mentioned, you saw really the complex part of it, which is not complex at all. You specify your base class and your register class. You have to call initialize base in the constructor function. Otherwise, nothing's going to work. Then you can add members, and you can override members. Relatively simple. So what you'll see here that's different from the previous code snippet is right here. Number 3, we're adding an employee ID getter and setter. And then down here, we're overriding a show name that already exists in the base class. And so by simply calling initialize base, you can pass back to your base class's constructor function any of the arguments that are required. And down at the bottom, we simply just specified the base in our register class. So it's relatively simple. We don't really have time to get into how you can accomplish inheritance inside of JavaScript. In fact, we did that in a previous webcast that you can find out on a link out to on www.robbagby.com. I've got a listing of all my webcasts out there, so you can actually go in and see the complexity of doing inheritance in typical JavaScript outside of our libraries, and it's quite complex. We've really made it very simple to implement here, just by simply calling register class, passing in your base, and then making sure you call initialize base. So let me just run through a quick demonstration. We'll just show some code and kind of see how everything works. And so what we've got here is, let's see, let me close this out. And I've got a couple samples here that we used in our earlier session on OO development using the Ajax libraries. And what you see here is just simple JavaScript. This has nothing to do with the ASP.NET Ajax. And I just use this to illustrate some of the relationships and how the prototype model works in JavaScript. What you see highlighted here is our constructor function. In this case, it's student, where we pass in a first name and last name arguments. And then down here, you see this is where we set a couple instance level fields. So if I need to store data by instance, I'll put those in the constructor function. In this case, we're going to store first name and last name. And by naming convention, we use the underscores, and that tells consumers of our classes that those are meant to be private, although they're actually public. They're meant to be private and not to depend on them. Typically just use the getter and setters. Down here you'll see I've got my prototype. So my student dot prototype gives me a reference to the prototype, and here's where I'm adding a function. And in that function is called stringize, and I'm just returning student and then the first name and last name. So if we take a look at some code that's calling that, inside of here, here's where I'm creating or newing up a student, and I'm getting an instance of that student constructor. Down here you'll see I'm alerting my student stringize method. Now if you'll remember, my student constructor didn't have a stringize method. If we click back, you'll see the stringize belongs to the prototype. So this just simply illustrates that you inherit members from the prototype of your constructor in JavaScript. So let's just see that one go. And this is under Demo 00 Development. So we'll view that in the browser, and we'll just kind of see how that one works. Just to prove it works, and it worked. So the next thing I want to show you is how everything works inside of ASP.NET Ajax and how we've extended this model and made it a bit more convenient for us by first adding the concept of namespaces. So here's that call to type.register namespace. And I've registered a namespace called callit.components. Down here I've created here's my constructor function, callit.components.person. And inside of here, I'm a good OO developer, or citizen anyways, and I call my initialize base. And inside of here, here's where I'm creating an instance level field where I'm going to store my name, which was passed in. Now I've created inside of my prototype, here's where I've created a getter and setter function where the public can go out and get access safely to my to this property, which is actually being stored in this instance level variable, and a method called showName. Then down here I call register class, passing it a fully qualified path to my class, and in this case I'm implementing sys.component, which we went into detail about the importance of in an earlier webcast. Now, down here I'm creating another class called employee that utilizes the same namespace, and in this case I'm extending the signature to pass an employee ID. Here when I call initialize base, I'm going to call reference to myself as well as pass the name to the person constructor, and then I'm going to add another instance level field. Down here I'm adding a getter and setter in my prototype for employee ID, and then I'm going to call register class on my employee, except this time I'm implementing my person. Now it's important to realize, let me scroll up here, my person prototype has a showName function. Okay? And if I scroll down, you'll note that my employee prototype doesn't have a showName. So as I go over to my calling code or my sample code and jump down to my ASP.NET Ajax classes examples, what you'll see here is the first thing I'm doing is creating an instance of my callit.components.person, and then I'm calling showName. Then I create an instance of my callit.components.employee calling showName, all the while knowing that the employee didn't have that showName implementation, but my person did. So let's just take a look at how that looks and run it. And both of these work just fine. So that just illustrates how inheritance works inside of ASP.NET Ajax, and as it turns out that's very important to us because as we start creating behaviors, what we're going to be doing is implementing sys.ui.behavior, which in turn implements sys.component, which implements a bunch of interfaces including sys.idisposable. So let's jump back into the slides and start getting out of our review mode and into what's new within behaviors. So the first thing we're going to take a look at and review very quickly sys.component, because that's what our behaviors are going to be inheriting from. So if you were in the last webcast on developing, creating controls, this should be review for you. If not, we'll go over pretty quickly. Every one of our controls or behaviors has a base class which is sys.component, which sys.component on its own has no UI representation. It's not associated with the DOM element. However, when we start building the behaviors and controls, we're going to associate those behaviors or controls with the DOM element. I'll show you that in just a minute. The purpose of sys.component is, one, to be a base class for controls and behavior, and secondly, for reusability and abstraction, to abstract the complexities of your classes away. Sys.component implements some things like iDisposable, so that you know that you have to implement a dispose method. So you get some great functionality out of the box, and if you really want to dig into this a little deeper, I would suggest you take a look at the Building Controls webcast we did at the last part of this series, and you can find that on robbagby.com. So a simple example of implementing a sys.component, if you look at the very bottom where we register the class, you'll see that we're implementing sys.component. Another thing to take a look at is, again, we're calling initialize base because we are inheriting from sys.component. What you don't see on this slide is the ability to override, say, dispose and initialize. So sys.component exposes an initialize that you can override, as well as dispose, which you can override. So if you want to initialize any variables, you do that in initialize, and if you want to, or say event handlers, wire up any event handlers, a good place to do that is in initialize, and then to clear your event handlers, a good place to do that is in dispose. So here's some of the notables for sys.component. Initialize, we just talked about. iDisposable, we just talked about. iNotify disposing exposes a disposing event that you can tie to, so you know when your component, or you can let others know when your component is disposing. That gets called in dispose. iNotify property changed, which we're going to be dealing with today, essentially lets you know that a property has changed, so you can raise an event letting folks know that the property has changed, a specific property has changed, and you typically expose that in one of your property setters. And we'll see an example of that as we start looking at our behaviors today. So creating a component, I just wanted to do a review on this as well, because this is important. The means by which you can create a component, you can either call sys.component.create, or we have a shortcut, $create. And inside of this, you essentially pass in 5 or at least 1 argument and then 4 optional arguments. So you have to pass in the type of the component to create is your first argument. So if I've created a component called samples.whatever, my type would be samples.whatever. The properties gives me the ability to pass in a JSON object that represents any properties that I want to initialize. So if I know that the component I'm creating has a start image property, I can pass in a JSON object that essentially has a name value pair start image and then the name of the image or the path to that image that I want to initialize. So here's your opportunity to very simply initialize any props inside of the component you're creating. You can do the same thing with wiring up event handlers. So you can pass in a JSON object that essentially passes in the name of the event that you want to wire to and your event handler. References are the same thing. Pass in a JSON object if you want to set a reference to, say, another component. It's very simple to do that in the create. And then lastly, element. You can, when you're building a behavior or a control, we're talking about behaviors today, so we'll kind of stick with that. The behavior component has to have an association with an actual DOM element, and that's typically the element that, in our case, we're going to be having our behavior affect. So we're going to be working with an example where the DOM element we're going to be passing in as a reference to an HTML image, and then we're going to affect that behavior by, when you do a mouse over, we're going to swap the image and have some kind of highlight image in there. So the element is actually the DOM element that you want to be working with or be affecting. So here's an example of a create. In this case, we're creating a component called controls.catalogControl. We're initializing property page size and setting it to 10. We're wiring up an event handler named item selected to the click event. We're not setting any references. And in this case, we're passing a reference to a DOM element named catalog. And $get, if you're not familiar with that, is a shortcut to what's typically document.getElementById or element.getElementById. So referencing a component, you just saw $get. You can, essentially, if you call $get, passing in the ID of the component you want to get, what will typically get called is document.getElementById. And if you pass in a parent element, you'll typically call parent element.getElementById. But however, there's a differing implementation in some of the browsers on how this works. So in some cases, you won't call parent element.getElementById. It will actually iterate through the child elements and find that child element. So this is very convenient for you to get a reference to a DOM element. Now, what if you want to get a reference to your component? So you've created this behavior component, and now you want to get a reference back to that component itself. Well, in that case, you call $find, and the signature looks the same. It's an ID and then an optional parent. And what's kind of cool about this is, because of the way the Ajax libraries are storing these components, when you call things like register class, it gives us the ability to easily find these components that have been created, where in typical JavaScript, it would be very difficult for you, if not impossible, for you to get a reference back to these objects that you're storing out. So it's a very convenient means by which you can get a reference back to a component you've created. So let's jump into some sys.ui.behavior specifics here, and then we'll walk through a demo and show you exactly how this behavior works. And if you remember the example I showed at the beginning where we kind of moused over that image and it brought up some kind of highlight image, I'll show you how I did that. So as mentioned, sys.ui.behavior inherits from sys.component. The behavior constructor has an element argument, and so you pass in an element when you would theoretically call this behavior, the constructor to be your behavior. Now that constructor gets called for you behind the scenes when you use $create or sys.component.create. But it's important for you to realize that that's what's actually happening, and your constructor does have to have this element. And so that element that you pass in maps to an element property, and there's actually inside of the sys.ui.behavior a get_element property that allows you to get a reference to that element that your behavior is associated with. And that's really the element that you're going to be acting upon within your behavior, and we'll see that throughout all of the sample code. And so that's really just associated with the DOM element that you passed in. So here's what it kind of looks like. When we pass a reference to the DOM element in $create, we're essentially passing a reference to, in this case, a next image element. And we call $get to get a reference to that. Now, get element in lower code sample gets me a reference back to that image that we passed in, or that where I varied image, img. That's actually now a reference back to next image. So then you can act upon it and do some interesting things like set its source, etc., which is what we're going to be doing in our samples today. So let's just jump in. As it turns out, behaviors are much easier to talk about and show when we're actually going through some code. So I'm just going to show you the code for our behavior, and then I'm going to, as we walk through this, I'll show you how as we went through all of our samples, our reviews, I'll point out all of the things that we reviewed as well. So we'll walk through this code kind of top to bottom. So here's my behavior. Again, maybe it's helpful for me to show you what this is going to look like. So we've got in my original sample application, as I mouse over, what's happening here is we're swapping out an image here to give me this nice behavior, highlighted image behavior. And all we're doing is swapping the image out, the image source. So let's see how we did that. Well, the first thing we did was we created a namespace called samples. And then here's my constructor function. So this is straight out of JavaScript. Samples.highlightBehavior. So that's going to be the fully qualified name of my class. And here's that element I said we have to pass into the constructor. So that's our DOM element that we're passing in. Now, we mentioned earlier that you need to call initialize base when you're essentially whenever you're going to be inheriting inside of ASP.NET Ajax. When you're creating that class, if you're going to be doing any inheritance, you have to call initialize base so for the inheritance to work. And if you splunk through the code which is available to you, you'll see that inside of initialize base is where we do some of the work to actually copy down our base classes members to the implementing classes. So it becomes a very important part of the infrastructure. Down here's where we're setting a couple of fields, and these are instance level fields. I've got a place where I'm going to store the original image for the image itself, and then I've got another place where I'm going to store the highlight image, or the image that we want to use when somebody mouses over. Down here we're creating our prototype, and so this is just straight out of JavaScript prototype model. Inside of here, this is where we start to get into some of the specifics of sys.behavior. I mentioned that sys.component has an initialize method, and we're overriding that here, and we're adding some functionality. Here, as good OO developers, when you override, you call the bases initialize. So this is how you call the base, call base method. Inside of here, you remember I said every behavior as well as control has a get element, getter, that allows you to get a reference back to that associated DOM element. So that's what I'm doing here. Just getting a reference to it, and you'll see that I'm going to add an event handler to that in just a minute. That's why I got a reference to it. Here I'm creating a delegate that's going to wrap an event handler that I'm going to use to wire up to the events that DOM element fires. And if you're looking to get some information, some more detailed information about events and why we have to create delegates and things like that inside of these libraries, we're going to be doing a webcast on that next month, and I'll talk to you about every aspect of events inside of the ASP.NET Ajax client library. So I'll hold off on talking about this until then. But suffice it to say, we're just creating a delegate, and we're calling add handler. And in add handler, we're essentially wiring up to the images mouse over event. We're wiring up our delegate, or this on mouse over, which I'll show you in just a minute. This is actually an event handler defined within the prototype. And I do the same thing for my images mouse out. I'm wiring up to the on mouse out. So the net is I have two event handlers, on mouse over and on mouse out, that are wired up to my mouse over and mouse out events. Now, I also mentioned we've got to dispose, because sys.component implements iDisposable, and we're implementing sys.component. We have a dispose that we can override. And in this case, we want to override it because we need to call clear handlers. We need to clear up these event handlers you saw me just create. So obviously we need to get rid of these so that we can reallocate. We don't want any dangling references out there. So we need to clear our handlers. And this is a great convenience method provided to us within the library that allows us to just simply call it, so we don't have to remember what event handlers we've wired up. And we'll go into more detail on this in the events webcast we're doing in June. Then we called our base dispose because we're good OO citizens. Inside of here, I'm exposing some properties. I just have a getter for my original image, and no one needs to set my original image. My original image is actually the source that was set on the image control itself. But I do want somebody to be able to set up, or to be able to essentially set the highlight image, or that being the image that we're going to swap out when we do the mouse over. Okay, and so I've got a getter as well as a setter, and you'll note in my setter I'm raising an event. So I'm raising that property changed event we talked about earlier. So somebody may want to know when they've changed or when somebody's changed the highlight image. So we're going to raise that event, and somebody has the ability to then listen for that. And it's a good idea inside of your property setters, if it is of value for somebody to be able to be made aware when you change that, to raise this event. So here are the event handlers I discussed earlier, on mouse over and on mouse out. So if you'll remember, on mouse over, we essentially wired that up to the mouse over event, and on mouse out, we wired that up to the mouse out event of our image control, or our image DOM element that gets passed in. So let's take a quick look at these event handlers. So inside of here, again, I'm going to call getElement to get a reference back to that base element. Now, I'm going to make sure that the image exists, it's not disabled, and that the image source isn't equal already to my highlighted image. If that's the case, I'm going to go ahead and store off my original image. So the image that was originally set, I'm going to store that off in that instance level field, and then I'm going to set the source to the highlighted image I passed, that somebody set. Now, normally I should do some things like making sure that that highlight image is valid or not, maybe in the setter or even here, but for the sake of space and clarity, we're just assuming somebody set that for me. Then on mouse out, again, I get a reference back to that associated, the associated DOM element, and as long as the it isn't disabled and it exists, I'm just going to set the source back to the original image. It's pretty clear and pretty simple implementation. Down here, we just call register class with my name, samples.highlightBehavior, and inside of here, I'm implementing my sys.ui.behavior. And then I call notify script loaded, and if you're curious as to what notify script loaded does, is it essentially tells the script manager that this script has been loaded, and so I can go on and load up the next script. And so I have a simple page that we can use to test this behavior that's maybe not as complex as that full catalog application we saw earlier. And so let's use that. It's called demo behavior. Let's first show you what it looks like in the browser. So I'm going to run demo behavior in the browser, and it's really just a scaled down version. If I mouse over this image here, you'll see I'm getting that mouse over behavior. Over here, this one's disabled, and so it's not doing that mouse over. I hope you can see that through live meeting, that as I'm moused over it, it looks different than it did before. And so I tried to make it as clear as possible that it's a different look, and I hope that comes across over live meeting. If not, you'll have to take my word for it. So let's see how this works, or how we essentially applied that behavior. It's pretty simple here. Again, if you want to see a full screen view, you can press F5, and then F5 again will bring you back. So you can go to full screen view. I'm going to go ahead to full code view here, and so I can just take a look here and show you how this works. You'll see I've got my script manager. My script manager has a reference to my highlight image behavior that we saw earlier, that JavaScript. And so this is really just going to emit out the JavaScript to the browser script with a path to this JavaScript down here. Now I have two images, my previous image and my next image, with the sources set. The one that was disabled, I just set disabled to true. And then inside of my application load, or at my load event handler, if you will, I essentially just wired up or created two instances of this behavior. So I called $create of my highlight behavior. Here's where I passed in the property. So in this case, I set the highlight image property to images whack next button highlighted .gif. And then down here, I passed in a reference to the next image DOM element, which is this right here. And I did the same thing for my other behavior. I created a samples.highlight behavior, passed in previous button highlight.gif, and passed in a reference to this previous image. And that's all I needed to do in order to get this to work. Okay. So relatively simple, and it's a really strong encapsulation of that behavior, so that anybody who wants to add this functionality can simply add this create into their code. In fact, if we take a look at inside of my catalog control, I have a portion, excuse the scrolling, but I have a part of the code called add navigation. And inside of add navigation, that's where I add in the arrows at the very bottom. And you'll see inside of here is where I actually added in that $create statement and passed a reference to the image that I created. And you'll see, you can take a look at this code. It'll be out on my website at robbagby.com within an hour after this presentation. And you should be able to get a reference and take a look and splunk through it and see how everything works. So, one more time, let's see this in action by simply adding a reference to my script inside of a script manager, and by doing these, essentially creating those behaviors inside of my, in this case I did it in the application load, I was able to get this behavior. And one last time taking a look at it, and I get this great functionality. And if I were to take that disabled off of my other control here, so if I took, if I take this disabled off, let's just Control X and save that, and then we refresh this, then this guy will be enabled as well. So that just kind of shows you how it works. Let's set this back because that doesn't really make much sense the way it was, and go back to the slides. So now we've really illustrated how simple it is to create a behavior. It's really simply just creating a class that implements behavior and knowing what you want to do and getting a reference back to that associated element. But what we can do with behaviors is kind of take it one step further and make it easier for developers to consume our behavior. And so let's talk about that. What we're doing is creating an extender control. An extender control is simply a control, a .NET control, if you will, that essentially implements extender control. So you just create a class, you inherit from extender control, and then you have to essentially implement it. When you implement extender control, you have to implement two things: get script descriptors and get script references. So the bottom one, get script references, is pretty clear. All you have to do there is just return back a reference to all of the script files that are required for that control, so it knows how to emit that script. So that's pretty simple. Get script descriptors is perhaps a little bit more complex, but not so much. What you have typically, or what is possible to occur, is inside of your script component, your behavior that you wrote in JavaScript, you've got certain getter and setter functions. And those getters and setters may have a different naming convention that you are using inside of your inside of the properties that you want to expose inside of your extender control. And so this gives you the means, get script descriptors gives you the means to really just map the two of those together. So you can essentially create a map between the two. So let's just jump in and do a demonstration and just see how this works. And so I'm going to jump in here, and let's go ahead, and I'm going to keep all of this stuff open so we can see it. And what we're going to do in our app code directory is we're just going to create a new item. And we're just going to create a class. So let's create a class, and we will call this guy, I don't know, Webcast highlight extender. Okay, and inside of my Webcast highlight extender, let everything catch up with me. I'm going to clear out some of these comments just so we can see a little bit better. And so the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to import a namespace. So I'm going to import using system.collections.generic. And we're going to use that collection, as we'll see in a little bit. And the next thing I'm going to do is add a namespace around this. And I'm just going to create a namespace called samples.extenders. And so now I've got my public class, and as I stated earlier, I need to implement extender control. And so as I extend that, I can simply go ahead and let the IDE show me what I need to implement. And you'll see if I go into full screen mode here, and again, if you need to go full screen on yours, it's F5 key. We'll do that, and F5 will get you back. Inside of here, it's going to override IEnumerable, get script descriptors, as well as get script references. And as we mentioned earlier, get script references is where I'm going to return back this collection of references back to all of the scripts that is required for this control. And get script descriptors is going to do the same for these maps. We're going to create these maps between controls, client-side controls, as well as the controls we're going to expose inside of, or properties we're going to expose inside of this extender. So that being said, well, before we get going too much further, I need to tell the infrastructure what type of components or what the target control type for this extender is going to be. And you can have multiple. In our case, we're just going to use an HTML image. So I'm just going to add a target control type attribute here, passing in my type of my HTML image. And we'll make it relatively simple here. And so I've essentially decorated the class with this to let it know that an HTML image is the appropriate type to extend in this case. So I stated earlier, we need to expose some properties inside of our extender that map over to those client-side properties we've got in our behavior. So in this case, let's create one. If you'll remember in our behavior, our getter and setter. Let me scroll down to the appropriate getter and setter in this. Our getter and setter were called original image, all spelled out, and we've got highlight image and highlight image. Well, we really only need to expose this highlight image, but I want to show you how the mapping works, so I'm not going to name it the same. We'll call it highlight IMG, just to kind of show how things work. And again, that was in our Ajax client behavior code. So let's go ahead and create this prop. And this is going to be a string, and we're going to call it highlight IMG. And then capital highlight IMG in this case. And so now I've got this property. And so in order for me to map between these two, I go into my get script descriptors. Let's delete this code here. Let me just put this in the center of the screen for ease of legibility. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to first create a collection that implements IEnumerable. So let's do list, and we'll do, in this case, script descriptor. And we'll just call this descriptors equals, and we'll new it up. Now what I want to do is create the descriptor for my highlight image. And so in this case, let's create a script behavior descriptor, and we'll just call it descriptor equals new script behavior descriptor. And in this case, we've got to pass in a couple things. We've got to pass in the type, and this is the string type is the type on the client. And so if you'll remember, if we take a look in our client, our type was samples.highlight behavior. So I'm just going to copy that, and we'll put it right there. Let me put this down on another line. And then it wants the element ID. And so in that case, it's going to be the client ID for my target control. So target control dot element ID or client ID, and there's my descriptor is created. And so now all I need to do is add the mapping. So descriptor dot add property, and in this case I'm going to pass in highlight image. If you remember, it's going to be the name of my property here, which is highlight image, let's see, right here. And so I'm just going to pass in this property, highlight image, and then map it back to this dot highlight image, which is my internal name here. And then I'm just going to call descriptors, add it into my collection, descriptors dot add descriptor. And that's all I need to do except for return my collection. And that side's done. Now this side, where we get script references, is considerably easier. In this case, all I need to do, again, is I need to create my collection. So let's do a list, and in this case it's going to be script reference. And we'll just call this script refs. And now down here I need to create the script reference to our script and then add that script. So I'm just going to do script reference equals new script reference. Oops, we can't use, oops, it's called help by mistake. So hang on one second while help loads up. Hit F1 instead of escape, so we have to wait until help loads up. My apologies. I used ref by mistake, and that's a keyword, so we'll just call this sref for script ref. And so in this case, equals new and script reference. And then down here, I'm just going to do sref.path equals, and I need to pass the path to my script reference. Let's get that in a second when we get out of full screen mode here. And then just into my script refs, I'm just going to add this sref. And we're pretty much done, except for we've got to return script refs. And then I need to set this path. And so if I look in the Solution Explorer, you'll take a look and you'll see that inside of my controls, I've got a highlight image behavior that we were looking at. So the path to this guy is going to be controls whack highlight image behavior.js. And so that's really all we need to do in order for this to work. So let's go ahead and get out of this full screen. And then here's help. Let me close help out. And let's build this and see how that works. Make sure everything compiles. We did everything correctly. Then we'll go over to our page and we'll our consuming page and show how we can then consume this extender. So our build succeeded. So everything's golden there. So let's go over here and to our page. And if you'll remember, in this page, in order to get the behavior tied to this image, we had to do a couple things. We had to have a script reference in here. And then down here, we had these $creates. And so what we're going to do is, this might be a little bit more complex than we want all of our typical server-side programmers to use. So what we're going to do is make this a little bit easier for them to essentially implement this. And so what we're going to do is, at the very top, I'm going to, I've already added in a register directive, and I've registered my samples.extenders, which I'm pretty sure is the namespace for my component here. So I've added in this register with samples.extenders, and I've set its tag prefix to SMP. And so I need to do that in order to expose this server control, and that's in my app code directory. And so the next thing I'm going to do is just show you we don't need this scripts anymore if we're going to use this extender control. So I'm going to comment that out. And you know what else I'm going to comment out? I'm going to comment out all of this. We're not going to use this script anymore. What we're going to do is just show you how we can simply wire up and by adding in this server-side control and pointing it to these image tags. So the first thing I need to do in these image tags, they already have an ID, which is prev-image, but I'm just going to give it a run at equals server. So we need to have that for our server-side control to see it. So we've got that, and now what I'm going to do is I'm just going to go ahead and add in a couple extenders here. So I'm going to do SMP : and you'll see there's my Webcast highlight extender. And then here's my here's the essential property that I need to set, which is my highlight image. And I'm going to set my highlight image to be reference to, I believe it's images / and then let me just take a look and see what this is. It's going to be next button highlight .gif, and then I'm going to set its ID equal to extend next. We'll give them a run at equals server, And then I need to set its target control ID to point at the actual target control or the image that I want to affect. So this is going to be the ID for my next image. So let me just go ahead and add this target control ID here. Target control ID equals next image. And let me just clean this up a little bit so we can see it a little bit more easily. Okay, so that should be relatively clear. That's tied to this image. And so let's add one in for the previous image. Just copy this down. And in this case, it's going to be previous button highlight.gif. And then we're going to name this, we'll just call this extender prev. And then run at server. And then this is going to be for my prev image, which is right here. And we should be good to go. This should work at this point. So let's go ahead and save this. And let's go ahead and run our demo behavior.aspx. And we now have the same behavior we had in the past. But we've greatly simplified the implementation. The only thing somebody needs to do in order to make this work is they need to add in this now ASP.NET control, this extender control, tie it to by passing the target control ID, setting that to be the image that they want to extend, if you will, and then set the highlight image. So we've made it very simple for somebody to consume our behavior. And so I would suggest you play with this and take a look at it, because this gives you a very easy means to expose functionality to some developers that may not have any experience working with the client-side JavaScript, but have a lot of experience working on the server side in ASP.NET. So let me jump back to our slides, and I think we are ready for any questions. So I'm going to open up the question manager and answer some questions that are in the queue. So the first question is, in ASP.NET Ajax, do we need to create classes for both the client, JavaScript, and server-side business logic? Do you have recommendations on structuring the VS 2005 project solution? So in ASP.NET Ajax, I'm not quite, creating classes, what I showed you here was I created my client-side behavior, which, as we saw, worked all by its lonesome. And we called $create or sys.component.create, and we could tie that back to an image and get the full behavior functionality without building any server-side classes. But what we got when we built that server-side extender, or the server-side class that implemented extender, was it was easier for me to expose that out to folks that may not be familiar with client-side coding. It may be unclear what $create is. It may be unclear how to wire it up in the appropriate place. This makes it very easy for you. Incidentally, after what I should have shown you, let me actually just go into the sharing slide real quick and show you something. If we go into sharing, if I run this, let me just run this again, demo behavior, view in browser, and let's just do a view source on it and take a look and see that all that really occurred here was we got the exact same implementation we had before. You remember this? sys.application.initialize. Inside of here we wired up an add init, and inside of here they did a $create, passing in the exact same thing you saw I did by hand. So all of that extender, the only thing the extender did was it abstracted away the complexity of doing that. And so hopefully that answers your question. You can do either. You can do both, but this makes it much easier. So I'm going to put that as answered in line. Easier for the consuming developers, anyways. So the next question is, why does sys.component handle dispose? I didn't think that JavaScript required garbage collection to prevent memory leaks, which is what disposing capability provides. that's what disposing capability, well, garbage collection is a .NET functionality. Memory leaks occur outside of .NET in every which way. And so if I did something like wire up an event handler to a DOM element, and then lose and no longer am referencing my component, because I have that reference, I'm not going to be able to reallocate that memory. So we want to not have these dangling references out there, which is really a memory leak. So that's why we implement dispose. This isn't .NET's dispose. It just followed the same naming convention. And if you look at quite a few languages, you'll see that a lot of varying languages that are not related use the word dispose by convention. And dispose is just simply a place in this implementation where we can clean up. And if we have any references to anything that we need to whack before we go bye-bye, that's where we do it. So I'm going to answer it in line. And then let's get to our next question. Can we take it as a rule to always extend the sys.component class for any non-visual class? For instance, employee or person class. Can we always extend the component class or no need? And this is from Bilal, who I've been corresponding with fairly often. Sys.component, I don't want to say always do it or always don't do it. Sys.component gives you some great functionality. It implements iDisposable. It implements iNotify disposing. It implements I think it's iProperty changed or something like that. And so if you want to utilize that functionality, it's a great means of getting that functionality. And so what you get, it also gives you like an initialize. And so if you want to initialize things, it's an infrastructural component. And so when I'm building non-visual classes where I'm passing information around, I typically implement sys.component. Because I typically am wiring up event handlers or exposing events, things like that, and I want the initialize, I want the dispose, and it makes it very convenient for me. So if you're going to utilize its functionality, then definitely implement it. Don't roll your own. I hope that helps. I guess maybe a short answer is usually. So I'm going to put that as answered in line and post that privately. I got another question. Would a better way to create an image behavior to use XAML? Well, XAML is, first of all, XAML is just a markup language. And so XAML is the markup language that is being used now for what is called Silverlight. And so if you're building a Silverlight application, XAML is a great way to implement that. XAML is also the back end or the markup language for WPF, which is really a client-side or forms-based applications. But XAML is also the way in which we can store out things like workflow. So XAML itself wouldn't get you there. XAML itself on a typical just all HTML website wouldn't get you there. So to create an image behavior on using HTML, you would use a great way of doing it is inside of our world using ASP.NET Ajax client libraries. There are a bunch of behaviors that are already out there for you. Now, if you wanted to create a Silverlight application, then certainly I would build that behavior utilizing its constructs, which include using XAML to store it as its markup. So I'm going to put that as answered in line. I hope that answers your question. If it doesn't, and sometimes I do misunderstand, please feel free to send me an email to rob.bagby@microsoft.com. Another question, within your highlight extender control, you hard-coded the references to the script file. To be flexible, should the script file be an embedded resource? Yes, that's a great catch. And Tyrone, that is great. You are exactly right. I just hard-coded it in there because of demonstration purposes, but I like where you went there, and that's exactly right. Next question. I thought the run at equals server tag resulted in the control being executed at the server at runtime as opposed to the client. Now it seems this is not the case. Is this still client-side, right? Confused a bit. The reason I used the run at equals server is because I needed to make sure that that control was available on load so that the ASP.NET infrastructure could see it when it was loading, when it was originally on the server. And you need that run at equals server so that it can get a reference to that image control and then essentially bind that extender control to it. Once it's pushed out to the client, still running client as always. So it's not doing any postbacks if that's your concern. That's not occurring, but we need to have that run at equals server just so when we're originally loading, when we're on the server, the original time, which will always be, and there's no way around, that we can get a reference to it and see it. So answered inline. You're welcome. And let's see, the next question. What was your URL again and you will be posting on again? So my URL is, my blog is, I'm going to put this in the answer, robbagby.com, and in there you'll get code and slides. And then I have rob.bagby@microsoft.com. That is my email. And I'll typically put the slides out to a couple days after the presentation, and then I will put the code out typically within an hour after the presentation. Raphael's question is, your sample code results in errors in standard environment. I think it contains some additional add-ins and configuration. How do I set them to run the sample directly? One thing, my sample code assumes you have .NET 3.0, so if you're running on Vista, you've got it, because I showed in an earlier webcast how you can call WCF services. So if you don't have that, you have to essentially either install .NET 3.0 or you have to back out the WCF implementation. The other issue you may find in there, I think there's a tag mapping section in there that surrounds some of the validation controls that some differing versions have some differing challenges with. So just find that and comment that out. If you have a further question, Raphael, please send me an email, rob.bagby@microsoft.com, and I'll forward you out the workaround there. Okay? And let's see, next question. What is responsible for calling dispose on the component behavior? If I created a class and did not descend from sys.component but implemented iDispose, would dispose get called when the object was freed? No, I don't believe so. I don't believe it would get called for you. I believe it's actually called, dispose is actually called in the sys.component implementation. You can double check that, or I can double check that by just looking at the Microsoft Ajax libraries. So, so just take a look at the Microsoft Ajax libraries and do a search on dispose, and you'll find it. That's kind of the convenient piece of this, is we have all of that available to us today. So, but I don't believe that by implementing iDispose, in fact, I know by implementing iDisposable, if you just implemented that yourself, it would not get called, because the question would be what would call it. Component does call that. So I'm going to put that as answered inline. And if you want a further pointer where to find that, don't hesitate to send me an email, and I will show you. I can actually get you to the exact line of code that calls that for you. And you mentioned that this was the 5th in the series. I thought it was the 4th. Please elucidate. That's a good word. That's a 10-cent word. This is the 5th in the series. I had an overview was the first, and then I did calling services, and then I did OO development, and then controls, and then now behavior. And if you go out to robbagby.com, you will find a singular post for my OO development, and it has a link out to that one. It was not part of the full list because I created that full list after I had done it. So I think that's it for all the questions I have. Well, actually we have another one. What's the impact of Silverlight development for ASP.NET in light of the fact that we can use C# now instead of JavaScript for client side? Does Silverlight mean that JavaScript is getting obsolete? Excellent webcast. No, it doesn't mean that JavaScript is getting obsolete. Rich RIA, or Rich Internet Applications, Silverlight is now our means by which we will create rich Internet applications. But as we all know, rich Internet applications run inside of a plugin in the browser, which not all folks are happy to do. Not everybody has the Flash. Not everybody's going to have Silverlight. It's just human nature. But everybody that has a browser has HTML. And so for real broad reach, you're not going to, in my opinion, and this is Rob Bagby's opinion, not Microsoft, you're not going to see all of the full applications deployed as Silverlight, or just as you don't see them full apps, or full webs anyways, deployed as Flash. What you're going to see are applications, smaller applications that are part of the entire offering built in Silverlight, and then the full applications or the full web still utilizing HTML, and then obviously Ajax to help make that environment quite a bit better. But that's a great question, one that gets asked quite a bit. I don't see Ajax going away. I don't see HTML going away. Silverlight, although gives you a great ability to create really cool, rich internet applications, it's not going to get rid of Ajax. And also, just as a quick FYI, Silverlight, when it wants to make calls down to services, is going to be using our Ajax libraries to make those calls down to those services. So I'm just going to mark that as answered in line. And I'll probably end up doing a series very similar to this on Ajax or on Silverlight, probably in July or August starting. Is there more in the Ajax webcast series? Your presentations have been helpful. Yes, there is more. Go out to robbagby.com, and I have this month's listings out there. I don't have next month's out there because I haven't gotten the full schedule yet. I will put those out there as soon as I get the full schedule, but I'm doing 3 more next month on events, and then tying into some of the services like membership and profile services. And so we got some good webcasts coming up. We've got 2 more this month, and those are going to be on, one is going to be on, one I'm going to do kind of summarize where we are today, what we've seen so far, and I'd have to go out to robbagby.com to see what the other one is on. So, Sarah, I think that's it for the questions.
All right. Just wanted to let you know right now on the screen is the Microsoft Zune that you can win by attending the live webcast and submitting the evaluation. You go ahead and put the evaluation up there right now for you to fill out. Just take a couple quick minutes to give Rob some feedback on his great webcast, and that will pop up there for you guys in just a minute. All right, so like I said, just take a couple quick minutes to do that. And Rob, if you want to stay on for a minute or so, maybe answer any last-minute questions that pop up, that would be great. But that will conclude the audio portion for today's conference.
Okay.
You may now disconnect, and thank you for attending.